Now, while there are a lot of events developing around the world in terms of the Vietnam War and this push between the Soviet Union and the United States for influence in these underdeveloped parts of the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, there are important developments taking place in the United States. The civil rights movement gained momentum and won political attention in the 1960s. The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, was at the center of the inauguration with the Freedom Rides. Now, CORE determined that they would test the government's commitment to enforcing a legal decision ordering the desegregation of interstate transit. And CORE launched a program in which interracial groups would travel throughout the South. Now, CORE informed the FBI and the Justice Department of the Freedom Rides, but the riders encountered Klan-led violence in Anniston and Birmingham, Alabama, and were ultimately forced to abandon their plan. Now, what these riders were doing was purchasing passes or tickets on buses and public transportation with the goal of just riding through areas that had held on to segregation. And the hope was that they would raise awareness and that they would kind of push the government to either support the law of the land or to side with these states that held on to segregationist ideas. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, took on the cause of the Freedom Rides. And they did this because they argued that if violence could stop any portion of the movement, that the entire civil rights movement would be ended. That's almost the same as this domino effect, that if one part of the movement is stopped, then the rest of it will cease. Now, the first riders on these buses were people in their 20s and in their 30s who supported this movement. Now what we see is these students, they're college students. So we're looking at, kids between the ages of 18 and 22, 24, some of the graduate students. Now the first bus that these SNCC students are riding on, reaches Montgomery, Alabama on May 20th, but it is attacked. With violence escalating and the riders determined to continue, the Kennedy administration sent federal marshals and pushed the Alabama government to ensure the safety of the civil rights activists in the state. Now, this was a big move on the part of Kennedy. Attorney General Robert Kennedy then pushed the Interstate Commerce Commission to prohibit the segregation of transportation facilities, but many Southerners refused to cooperate. This prompted SNCC members to push harder to end segregation in other aspects of public life. Remember, at this particular time, not only are schools segregated, but restaurants are segregated, movie theaters are segregated, even grocery stores and gas stations and such are segregated or have an area that only serves Black patrons. In 1962, James Meredith attempted to become the first Black student to register at the University of Mississippi, but Mississippi's segregationist governor, Ross Barnett, blocked him. This move triggered a campus-wide riot in which 2 bystanders were killed. In 1963, the civil rights movement took center stage in Birmingham, Alabama, with a fight against employment discrimination, segregation, and police brutality fueling activism. In Birmingham, protesters, many of whom were children, and some of whom were as young as 6 years old, encountered violence when Police Commissioner Eugene Connor, called Bull Connor, used police dogs and fire hoses on the protesters and ordered mass arrests. In response, Kennedy sent federal negotiators to end the conflict, but in spite of the negotiators' success, on Sunday, September 15th, 1963, 4 young black girls were killed when the Ku Klux Klan set off dynamite at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. On June 11th of 1963, Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address on civil rights, arguing that civil rights posed what he called a moral crisis for the nation, and suggesting that the United States pass civil rights legislation to end segregation in public accommodations and schools, and ensure that blacks had access to the ballot. Kennedy's speech came in the context of resistance to civil rights. Alabama Governor George Wallace had personally blocked access of 2 students to the University of Alabama, requiring that federal marshals and the Alabama National Guard would step in. Now, George Wallace is an interesting figure in the civil rights history because he is the governor who, when he was reelected, in his inauguration speech said, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And as he is saying those words, he is just beating, violently on the podium. And the people who are attending his inauguration are cheering. And so that indicates that the people agreed with his message of segregation. But to physically go and stand in the doorway and say, "You may not enter this school," was a very bold act on the part of Governor Wallace, who enjoyed success as governor and a lot of love from the people of Alabama. The same day, Mississippi leader from the NAACP named Medgar Evers was gunned down in his driveway by Byron de la Beckwith. In spite of the escalating violence, Congress stalled on passing civil rights legislation. So the civil rights leaders organized a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. More than 250,000 protesters assembled on the front lawn of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963. Speeches ranged from John Lewis's militant criticism of the Kennedy administration to Martin Luther King Jr.'s very hopeful "I Have a Dream" speech. After Kennedy's death, Johnson made civil rights a priority and triumphed over the Southern filibusters to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which ended discrimination in public accommodations and facilitated the integration of schools. It also improved access to the right to vote and gave the federal government a stronger role in mediating racial conflicts. Now, remember, with the Brown decision, the court left a caveat in there that said that schools should be integrated at all deliberate speed. And this really allowed those who wanted to stall segregation to easily prolong the integration of schools. But this 1964 Civil Rights Act makes that very difficult. Now, in spite of the leap forward that Johnson had made with the Civil Rights Act, discrimination in voting was a persistent problem in the South, with the use of literacy tests, poll taxes, and administrative bias to disfranchise African Americans. Now, these literacy tests were administered by a person who worked at the polls. And so they were very subjective. And even if an African American came in and could read well, there wasn't really any way to prove that. And the administrator could just say, well, I don't think that you truly read well or that you understand the responsibility of voting. Now, the civil rights movement responded to the slow pace of change with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, all working together to organize Freedom Summer in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer Project utilized 800 volunteers, most of whom were white college students from across the country, to work to register voters and improve education for students in segregated schools. Now, it's important to understand that by bringing these white students into places in the South, the students were certainly going to be at risk and put in jeopardy, but the hope was that their efforts would gain national attention. White Southerners violently resisted Freedom Summer, and in late June 1964, the Ku Klux Klan members murdered 3 civil rights workers. In spite of the capture of the killers, the violence does continue. Now, out of the Freedom Summer came the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which functioned as an alternative to the all-white Democratic Party in the state of Mississippi. In August of 1963, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sent a delegation to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, but the delegates were not allowed to be seated, which meant they could not participate. This delegation included a delegate named Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a Mississippi plantation worker and who had been fired for her efforts to register voters. Hamer gave a passionate and televised testimony that prompted Lyndon Johnson to propose a compromise in which the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would receive the 2 at-large seats of the regular Mississippi delegation and would swear that they would support the Democratic presidential ticket. Now, it's important to remember that Kennedy was a Democrat, as is Johnson, and Johnson's concern here is that if there is division between this Mississippi Freedom Democrat Party and the larger Democrat Party from Mississippi, that other African Americans will support this Freedom delegation and not the larger Democratic Party, and that would make it very difficult for Johnson to be reelected. Now, neither side was willing to accept this compromise, but in 1968, an integrated Mississippi delegation attended the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Freedom Summer spread across the South after February of 1965, when a murder of black activists by state troopers garnered the attention of Martin Luther King Jr., who called for a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery in order to press the governor to enforce civil rights. On March 7th, law enforcement officials sprayed the marchers with tear gas, beat them, and turned them back to Selma. Shortly thereafter, a white clergyman who had joined the protesters was murdered by a group of whites in Selma. As marchers eventually succeeded in reaching Montgomery on March 25th, the Klan murdered a white female marcher from Michigan. The violence of white resistance and the commitment of the marchers pushed Johnson in an address to Congress and the nation to ask for voting rights legislation. In his address, Johnson invoked the Civil Rights Anthem, stating that, quote, "It is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. We shall overcome," end quote. Now, remember way back with the 15th Amendment, African American men are granted the right to vote. Women are not granted the right to vote until 1920. But African Americans, male and female, are restricted through other means. So Johnson calls for a specific act that will remove any barriers that are in place, like the poll taxes and the literacy tests. On August 6, 1965, Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act, which banned all barriers that were used to deny blacks the access to the franchise. This included poll taxes and literacy tests. The legislation also increased federal enforcement and required states with very troubled histories in voting to consult with the federal government before they made any changes to the law. Even with these victories, the civil rights movement began to fracture. Organizations like SNCC and CORE came to distrust the administration for failing to provide protection for voter registration workers. Now, this chart shows us the percentage of African Americans who are registered to vote in the South. Now, it's important to know that voting access isn't that much better in the North, but it's certainly less violent. In 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, we see that about 12% of African Americans are registered to vote. We see those numbers begin to increase in 1960 and 1962 with the election of President Kennedy and the efforts of the civil rights workers to register African Americans to vote. But we see the biggest incline after African Americans receive the Voting Rights Act, which removes any legal barriers that are in place. Now, it is important to keep in mind that being able to register to vote doesn't necessarily guarantee that a person will be able or choose to actually go in and vote. On May 22, 1964, Johnson spoke to an audience about his hope for achieving what he called the Great Society through an enactment of a series of liberal social programs designed to solve the problems of race and poverty by improving conditions in urban areas, the environment, and education. The Johnson administration was able to pass several far-reaching laws, including the Elementary and Secondary School Act, which provided federal funds directly to public schools to help improve their quality. The Great Society platform also emphasized the need for environmental protection and succeeded in passing hundreds of laws that targeted air and water pollution, waste disposal, the use of natural resources, and the preservation of wildlife. Johnson attacked poverty by building on the foundation that Kennedy had laid before his assassination, the provision of federal aid to impoverished areas. Johnson designed the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 to provide assistance to the poor, including job training, education, and a program called Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, and the Community Action Program, or CAP, which was intended to involve poor people in efforts to improve their communities. Within 5 years, the Johnson administration's programs reduced the overall poverty rate from 20% to 13% and pushed the rate of Black poverty from 40% to 20%. Johnson's war on poverty emphasized economic growth as a path toward a more even distribution of wealth, and Johnson built on the 1962 Revenue Act by cutting taxes across the board by the end of the decade. The gross national product had increased by $400 billion. Johnson's war on poverty was a key component in his 1964 presidential campaign against Barry Goldwater. His opponent represented the surge of right-wing conservatism, arguing that the government was too large and that the Johnson administration was not fighting hard enough in the Cold War. Remember, the Cold War is still raging, and the United States is still involved militarily in Vietnam. But Johnson easily won re-election. Johnson's victory produced significant change, with the 89th Congress approving aid to public schools, Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, funding to cities for local improvements, increases in the minimum wage, the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, immigration reform, and environmental improvements. This was a time of tremendous involvement on the part of Congress in the day-to-day lives and activities in the United States. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, recall Earl Warren is the one who said that separate but unequal is inherently unequal and has no place in public schools. Chief Justice Earl Warren was in step with the liberal policies of the Johnson administration, and affirming the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act and striking down the poll taxes in 1966, thus ending and then later ending restrictions on interracial marriage. This is a time of great progress in our nation's history. Many cases go all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sides with the liberal progressive ideas of the day. One of the most famous cases, of course, being Loving v. Virginia, in which the Supreme Court ruled that people of different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, could legally marry anywhere in the United States. The Warren Court also ruled that Southern schools, which had been dragging their heels with terms of school integration since the Brown decision, could no longer postpone. In 1963, the Warren Court ruled in Gideon v. Wainwright that states had to provide an attorney to individuals who could not afford an attorney. That's the Gideon v. Wainwright case. If you are arrested and cannot afford to hire a lawyer, the state is legally required to provide you with counsel. The Warren Court also handed down the Miranda v. Arizona case in 1963, in which the court ruled that police had to inform individuals under arrest of their rights under the Constitution. Remember, this is the early 60s, and most public schools are funded only locally. They haven't received federal funding yet. And so the majority of people cannot even afford to attend school, and there isn't really a mandate to attend school either. So many people, primarily lower income, poor people, immigrants, African Americans, and even some middle class, have no idea what their constitutional rights are. They don't know that they have the Fifth Amendment right. They don't know that they have the right to have an attorney. And so with this Miranda case, it becomes a requirement that a person be informed of all of their rights. Other decisions also reflected the new liberal perspective of the court, which in 1962 ruled against prayer in school. The court also ruled in 1965 that states could not ban the sale of contraceptives because doing so was an invasion of privacy. The court also ruled in 1966 that states could not ban any form of pornographic material. Inspired by the civil rights movement, a generation of young activists embraced ideas of freedom, equality, community, and protested against the war, poverty, racism, the corporatization of society, sexism, and environmental devastation. This was a time in which people became very concerned about all forms of what they perceived to be injustice. In 1961, a graduate student named Tom Hayden used SNCC as a model for organizing Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, which drew membership mainly from heavily white college campuses. The SDS was the foundation for what was called the New Left movement that criticized the Cold War, mainstreamed liberalism, racism, and inadequate college education for undergraduates, and called for a participatory democracy which would put power and authority back in the hands of the people. Other organizations and movements cropped up alongside the SDS, including the Freedom of Speech movement, which was established at the University of California at Berkeley to protest the repression of civil rights activism on campus. The Freedom of Speech movement united Berkeley students and faculty in protest when California Governor Edmund Brown sent the police to evict the demonstrators. Over the next few years, the FSM spread across the nation. Restrictions on freedom of speech were not all that riled resentment and frustration among young people across the nation. As the Vietnam War had escalated, students in particular began to fear and fight the draft. In 1966, with 250,000 troop surges on the horizon, students engaged in a wave of protest. These students recognized that they would be drafted with this troop surge. Though college protests and draft dodging attracted significant attention, only about 1/5 of all college students actually participated. Protests intensified over the course of 1967, with anti-war sentiment spreading beyond college students to include professionals, politicians, and artists. By 1968, the SDS had split into factions, with the most radical branch, the Weathermen, using violence to make its point. Now, this is a really important thing that starts to take place through the 1960s. Movements start off with very similar goals and objectives, but over time, movements begin to separate and break off into more militant or violent factions and more passive factions, and those who prefer to wait. The New Left spurred a rise in a counterculture in which young people rejected traditional values, sexual restraint, and complacency of the middle class, and emphasized instant gratification, embracing the moment, and using drugs like marijuana and LSD. Members of the counterculture, known as hippies, proclaimed their lack of respect for elders using slogans such as "Don't trust anyone over 30," and expressing concerns about bureaucracy, modern technology, and nuclear annihilation. The counterculture celebrated rock and roll music's ability to intersect a popular sound with social and political ideas. This is characterized by Bob Dylan in a song, The Times They Are A-Changin'. The Beatles, a British rock band, transitioned from writing songs about love to writing songs about politics and embraced a psychedelic style. Other popular bands embraced similar aesthetics as well. They include the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and The Doors. In addition, soul music gained increasing popularity in the 1960s, with Motown Records emerging in Detroit, Michigan, and Stax Records operating out of Memphis, Tennessee. The counterculture embraced a sexual revolution, celebrating deviation from traditional standards of monogamy, fidelity, moderation, by engaging in casual sex, extramarital sex, group sex, and public nudity. Countercultural sexual mores were present in popular culture with the Broadway musical Hair, which featured frontal nudity in the movie. This and other risque films were more widely available, but labeled with an R or an X rating. For women, changing standards and sexual culture led them to the pursuit of sexual pleasure and freedom that was made possible with the availability of the birth control pill. Even country music saw a celebration of this movement with the song The Pill. The culture of the civil rights, social consciousness, and sexual freedom fostered a resurgence in the women's movement, which highlighted the fact that women had unequal access to employment and education and lacked political power and control over their own reproduction. By 1960, women made up about 1/3 of the labor force and about 35% of college enrollments, and they participated widely in the 1960s movements, which provided them with the foundation for fueling additional protest. In 1961, Kennedy created the Commission on the Status of Women, and in 1963, the Commission issued American Woman, which was a report that cited workplace inequality and prompted the passage of the Equal Pay Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned sexual bias in employment and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is still around today. However, women were split on the Equal Rights Amendment, which was first proposed back in 1923 by Alice Paul. The 1963 publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave the women's movement further momentum by raising questions about the ways in which society dictated gender roles. The book highlighted the frustration, loneliness, and isolation of women that Friedan had studied and had experienced. But it failed to connect with the experiences of the working class immigrant and African American women who did not have the option of staying home and becoming bored. So while Friedan is doing this research and she's interviewing women and she's asking about their daily life and their activities and their work and how they're treated, she does not interview working class women, immigrant women, or African American women. So she has a very narrow scope in the type of woman that she is representing. In October 1966, Friedan and her associates established the National Organization for Women, NOW, which promoted sexual equality, the passage of the ERA, maternity leave, the establishment of child care centers, and reproductive rights. NOW was a predominantly white middle-class organization, as African American women, for instance, tended to focus more on civil rights issues over women's liberation issues. But NOW's membership nonetheless grew from 1,000 in 1966 to more than 15,000 in 1971. Though women were central to social movements of the 1960s. They routinely encountered discrimination in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. Women responded to this discrimination by forming separate organizations that used radical tactics to critique patriarchy and traditional gender roles, picketing the Miss America pageant, publicly discarding makeup and undergarments, and forming separate women's collectives. You often hear of women who burned bras in the 1960s. This is those women. Among the most significant victories for women's liberation was the 1973 Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade, which outlawed state restrictions on abortion during the first trimester and declared that abortion was a private medical issue. Though Roe v. Wade was a decision celebrated in some circles, people who viewed abortion as murder of a human child rallied against the ruling, triggering a cultural battleground that has continued relevance today. It's also important to understand that many people who did not support Roe v. Wade were women. Militant individuals and organizations gained popularity in most sectors of the left. Among them, Malcolm X, who offered a new sense of racial consciousness and pride and religion for African Americans. While serving time in prison, Malcolm Little converted to the Nation of Islam, a religious sect based partly on Muslim teachings and partly on the notion that white people are the devil. After his release, Malcolm changed his last name to X to symbolize the fact that his African ancestry was unknown. Malcolm X encouraged African Americans to embrace self-determination, racial pride, and self-defense, criticizing the more mainstream African American leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. for not protecting women and children. Though he eventually gravitated away from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X continued to promote self-determination, and his influence on young Black activists was significant. He was murdered in 1965 by members of the Nation of Islam. Blacks who followed Malcolm X's teachings also rejected Dr. King and Bayard Rustin as leaders, favoring Black power, self-defense, and separation from whites. In 1966, SNCC followed suit by expelling all white members and embracing the slogan Black Power. Stokely Carmichael was a famous leader of this Black Power or Black Panther party that develops in the 1960s. Now, part of this argument is that there cannot be true racial equality if any white person is a part of this movement to achieve equality. The benefits of civil rights legislation failed to reach Black Northerners who were living with racism that existed outside of the legal structure of Jim Crow. Housing conditions were despicable. Poverty and unemployment were high, and the police disproportionately targeted Black communities. Whites perceived ghetto uprisings as examples of bad behavior, but Blacks saw the rebellions, as signaling political protest and frustration. In 1966, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, college students in Oklahoma, formed the Black Panther Party, which placed the experiences of Black Americans in a global context and presented their image as masculine strength and self-determination. They believed that the nonviolent civil rights movement of Dr. King was a more feminine movement. The Black Panthers also sought to improve community life and life in Black urban areas by creating daycare centers and healthcare facilities, but they often ended up in violent confrontations. Other groups embraced militancy as well, with impoverished workers criticizing Johnson's lackluster commitment to the war on poverty in the face of the increasing war in Vietnam. For Latinos, the majority of whom were new to the United States in the 1960s, discrimination was a persistent problem. Cesar Chavez embraced Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence, leading an effort to improve condition for Mexican farm workers. Chavez established the National Farm Workers Association in 1962. 3 years later, the union launched a strike against the California grape growers. The younger Mexican Americans formed what was called the Brown Berets, which was an organization like the Black Panther Party that advocated for self-defense and rejected any form of assimilation. In 1969, more than 1,500 Mexican American activists met in Denver, Colorado, where they adopted the term Chicano to convey their cultural pride and identity, and created a new political organization, the La Raza Unida, or the United Race. This organization advocated for bilingual education, job creation, and supported the establishment of a Chicano studies program in colleges. It also supported the expansion of Voting Rights Act to cover areas of the country in which Hispanic population had poor English skills and voter registration was very low. Puerto Ricans also organized a group to promote and protect their communities, the Young Lords Party, which was established in Chicago, soon spread to New York City. This organization established inner-city breakfast programs and medical clinics while supporting bilingual education in public schools and advocating for Puerto Rico's independence. American Indians also embraced the surge of activism as well and sought to improve their conditions through the American Indian Movement, which was established in 1968, with the purpose of combating poverty, alcoholism, unemployment, low life expectancy, and lack of education within the American Indian community. In 1969, the American Indian Movement members occupied Alcatraz Penitentiary, an abandoned prison island in San Francisco Bay. In 1972, AIM moved into the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters in Washington, D.C. to push for reparations for treaty violations and the abolition of the Bureau. The American Indian Movement also holed up in a village called Wounded Knee in South Dakota, holding 11 hostages for 70 days to call attention to the poor living conditions on the reservations. The occupation ended in a violent confrontation in which one protester was killed and another wounded. Asian American college students on the West Coast formed their own liberation movements as well, often partnering with Black students to work for increased equality and visibility of their history. At San Francisco State, Asian American students worked with the Black Student Union and established programs of Asian American and Black studies after going on strike for 5 months. At this time, many Japanese American high school and college students were learning about their parents' and grandparents' internment for the first time. The activism of the generation helped to convince the moderate Japanese American Citizens League to endorse reparations for internees. The 2-decade campaign would not be successful until the 1990s. The gay liberation movement also drew the civil rights movement as well, as homosexuals began to break away from their secretive existence of the 1950s. Police in New York City had regularly targeted and raided the Stonewall Tavern, which was a popular gay establishment. But on June 27, 1969, the bar's patrons fought back, triggering a new movement that expressed gay pride and demanded equal treatment regardless of sexual orientation. Liberalism seemed vibrant in the 1960s. But while social movements further to the left had significant momentum, they were not unchallenged, and conservatives drew increasing support. The 1960s conservatism fused libertarianism, laissez-faire economics, religious devotion, family values, and opposition to communism and social welfare. This new generation of conservatives believed that the United States must play a central role in fighting communism around the world, but rejected the influence of the United Nations. Individuals and organizations such as William F. Buckley and the National Review, and Reverend Billy Joe Hargis and his Christian Crusade, and Dr. Frederick Charles Schwartz and his Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, and the John Birch Society all crystallized the conservative philosophy and disseminated it through broadcasts and written works. The new conservatism bubbled up in the Sunbelt suburbs, where women were central to the movement, advocating abstinence, education, religion in public schools, and patriotism. In politics, Barry Goldwater captured the attention of young conservatives, and his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, he argued that the United States should abolish Social Security, do away with the Tennessee Valley Authority, and get rid of the progressive income tax. These were entities that he saw as expansion of the federal government, and what he had hoped for was a return to a smaller size of government. Goldwater also opposed the Brown versus Board of Education decision and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, giving him clout among white Southern Democrats. But he also advocated for increased military spending at the same time that he was advocating for a smaller federal government. Now, he's advocating for this increase in military spending because he believes that the United States should be more aggressive in dealing with the situation in Vietnam. Though he was very popular with conservatives, his policies were much too far to the right for the voters of 1964. Now, George Wallace, remember, from Alabama, who is standing in the doorway to prevent segregation, also becomes a presence on the national political scene. In 1964, in his presidential campaign, he captures the attention of white Southerners who were opposed to civil rights and the white Northerners who were very frustrated and anxious about these militant civil rights movements that were growing momentum in northern areas. The whites in the North were very concerned about school busing, in which African American students would be bused into formerly all-white schools and vice versa. George Wallace also promoted efforts, was also in support of keeping segregation in place, and those in the North who were concerned were benefiting from this long history of residential segregation, where people of color were not allowed to buy a home in a white neighborhood. Wallace did win a significant portion of the vote in the Democratic primaries in Indiana, Wisconsin, and Maryland. Again, it's important to note this because those are not conservative or southern states. They are kind of northern states or states that have a history of being border states. Although Goldwater ran a campaign that won wider support, Wallace's politics rallied the working class Americans who approved of his attacks on college students and liberal elites, and his dismissal of racial extremists and the counterculture. We see a time in the 1960s in which a lot of different groups of people are beginning to speak out about issues that concern them. Some of those groups are unmarried women or married women, African American women and women of color, white women. We see a fracturing of the civil rights movement from a more peaceful and nonviolent Dr. King type movement to a more aggressive, militant Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Black Panther type of movement. We also see that minority groups that have been long ignored, Asian Americans, American Indians, gay Americans, are now starting to speak out and advocate for their rights and make their voices heard.